So we recently hit 40,000 subscribers, which is absolutely wild considering last time I was thanking people for subscribing, it was somewhere around the thousands, 3,000, I think. I didn't expect to grow as much as I have in the past year or so, but it's been absolutely amazing, and I can't thank y'all enough for deciding you'd like to join me on this weird little journey I have going. And I decided that since I had a Q&A on the back burner as something to fall back on if I was ever in a rut with something, it it's kind of perfect because now it also coincides with a subscriber milestone, and if you can't tell, this is going to be entirely unscripted because I can't script a Q&A. I've just picked up a handful of questions, and hopefully this turns out not to be a complete disaster. We're gonna start with the patrons, and then I'm gonna hop over to YouTube where I took questions in the community tab. So let's get started with the patrons. My go-to question for people is always this: what are your favorite kinds of characters and stories? That is a very broad question, and one I probably have to think a bit about. On the whole, I would say I'm a sucker for stories that emphasize the importance of hope. I think probably because I grew up with The Lord of the Rings basically being super important, both in my family and just to me personally. So that kind of set the tone a bit. And I also very much like what Tolkien did in giving us this world which is basically, I would say, post-apocalyptic. Like, all of the ancient great heroes and magic, that time has passed and is passing, and having to let that go and finding a way to be content with what we have left is very, I would say, central to the whole story. Yeah, I think it's safe to say that Tolkien absolutely sowed the seeds for the kinds of stories I like the most. What are your feelings on math, both in general and in education? Well, this one's interesting because for the longest time as a kid, I had very good grades in math. I was one of the best students in the subject. I actually liked math a lot as a kid. There was one year during my högstadie career when I basically got tens on almost all of my tests. And if you don't know, the grading scale is like 1 to 10, so that's perfect scores. And I was very proud of that for obvious reasons. Especially during that time in my life, I was having a horrendous time, medically speaking, so that I managed to keep my grades up during that was something I'm still actually very proud of. But then I got to gymnasiet, which I think closest analogy would be high school for US Americans. And my health wasn't getting any better, and the subjects were getting harder, and I missed a lot of classes, and at some point I just hit a wall, and the stuff we were doing no longer made sense to me. I think I missed some very key lesson about square roots that, or my teacher was just absolutely dog shit at explaining it, because I could never wrap my head around them. I still don't know how they work, and I never got the help I needed in catching up and eventually dropped out, so I guess that kind of covers the in education bit of the question. At least for Finland, I can't speak on anywhere else in the world, obviously. But in general, I actually think math is really cool. It's involved in so many more areas than most people tend to think it is, and there's just something very neat about it. Are there any video games you play that have stood out to you as either really good in terms of queer/disabled rep, and if not, what could your fave games do better in adding queer and or disabled rep? Well, yes, I do game. I think it's a pretty well understood thing in the video game space that if you want actually good queer representation, you kind of have to go to the indie space. Like, there are some titles by bigger studios that have queer representation, but I don't know that I can think of a single title where that would be in any way, like, standout. As for disability, that question is a lot more interesting because on main characters specifically, any disability they have tends to be entirely cosmetic because the game wants to keep that whole video game as escapism power fantasy thing going. So any game developer would obviously hesitate to bring any kind of actual disability into the mechanics. And I kind of understand why, but I still think it would be kind of cool to see how someone would handle reflecting a disability through actual game mechanics in a game that's not specifically about that. On the other hand, side characters games can do pretty much whatever they want with, so you tend to see a lot more disabled characters in like the NPC cast, and here I'm most familiar, like personally, with FromSoft titles, and they exist in this really interesting space where it comes to disability, where so many of their characters could be classed as disabled. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, the Dark Souls games, specifically at least, actually do kind of have that whole reflecting a disability question mark in the game mechanics, because if you're hollow and haven't restored your humanity, that cuts off a chunk of the available gameplay to you. Like, you cannot invade or be invaded unless you restore your humanity at a bonfire. But in terms of FromSoft titles, I think the one that really grabs disability as a concept and does the most with it, surprisingly, isn't Sekiro. The one I would call for that is Bloodborne, because, of course, there are the old men who will cackle loudly while shooting you with wild abandon from their wheelchairs, which is fucking hilarious. And there's Gehrman himself, who's like an ambulatory wheelchair user, I guess. And so much of that game is, like, so viscerally about the human body that I don't think you could write a story like this without touching on some themes that could be explored through a lens of disability. I got so off topic. What the hell am I talking about? um, See, this is what you don't get when you get my scripted videos. You don't really get, like, the raw, unfiltered ADHD. But yeah, I haven't played Bloodborne. I desperately want to, but I don't own a PlayStation of any kind, and I'm not buying an entire goddamn video game console because I want to play one game on it. That's just not something I'm gonna do. What made you start the channel, / what are your hopes and goals for it in the future, / any contemplation of changing course or experimenting, or are you happy with how it's going? I'm gonna answer that part of this first. Honestly, starting this channel was kind of accidental, which sounds super weird, but if you go way back to, like, the first few videos I put out, I think the first one is a time-lapse of the sky, or a short video of some birds singing in a winter forest. They're there because I fully did not intend for this channel to become what it is today. At the time, I just needed somewhere to put these videos, and I think there was just something up with those particular videos, and the social media platforms I was on didn't handle them the way I wanted them to, but I wanted to share them with my friends, so I turned to YouTube, obviously. And if you also go that far back, you'll see that at the start of this channel, I was just, like, baking stuff and just doing stuff in the kitchen and making videos about the process and throwing them up there because, I don't know. I didn't want to become like a baking channel or anything. I think that's pretty obvious when you watch them. Um, Mostly, I think I just like liked documenting the process of making something in the kitchen. It was fun. So I think I've already changed course pretty drastically, and all of that's down to one video I made on a whim about like some of my favorite disabled characters, and that kind of got the ball rolling, and now we're here today. I'm gonna stick with disability and queerness. I think it's pretty safe to say that those are gonna probably be the central topics of my videos, or most of them at least. But I also kind of just make the videos I want to make, which probably isn't good from like a strategy perspective, but I also don't think I could do this if I didn't approach it like that. If I have to pick like a specific hope or goal for the future, I think there's a video I've been kicking around in my brain about like ableism in Christianity, which obviously is like a topic and a half, and it would be very research intensive, so I'm not saying it's gonna happen. I am saying I would be pretty interested in doing a video on that. Have you just always had a knack for thinking about multiple layers of media and rep? Did you take classes? Did you have a friend who was good at it and you learned from them? Um, well, first of all, thank you. Honestly, I took classes in the same way every kid who went through like basic education in Finland took classes, because we did the whole thing of like read this piece of writing, analyze it, tell us the themes and stuff like that. And I always liked that part of those classes, and I liked thinking about stories a lot. Like, I wrote my first story when I was like around 5 or something, I think. My sister and I put together this homemade little booklet for, I think it was either our mom's birthday or Mother's Day. I can't remember which one, but we essentially like put together a story, like made up a story and made a book, quote unquote, and gave that to our mom. And that was my first experience with writing. And then when I was 7, I decided I wanted to write a fantasy series, and actually kind of started writing one, which I still remember like the concept of it. It was bizarre. But that's not what this question is about. So I think I've always liked stories, and I've always liked thinking about stories, and from there I just like naturally, as I grew older, continued liking to think about stories, but obviously with more maturity came like deeper consideration, and like I've been world building since I was a little kid, so I've always really liked to think about the minutia of what happens in a story and how things make sense and how they go together. And I went through like that edgy teenage phase where I was a fan of CinemaSins, which, yes, you can make fun of me for that, because like all they do is nitpick. There's no actual deep thought going into that. But then I started to see the problems in their approach and how much more interesting things were when you look at them in a layered way. I think the best thing I ever learned for analyzing media is that you can just not like something without there being something inherently wrong with it. And in contrary, you can like something and still criticize it. And I think that's where I flourish. Do you resonate with the concept of disability pride? Why or why not? Yes, I do. And I honestly think it's kind of important. And again, the first Pride was a riot. And when I think about it in those terms, my mind immediately goes to the protesters who literally dragged themselves up the Capitol steps to demonstrate the need for the ADA. And yes, I'm proud to be disabled. Because the fact that I am disabled and alive, first of all, and have a relatively good life with access to most of the things I need and support, it's all come on the backs of other disabled people who've come before me and are allies who have fought for me to be able to be here and live my life in relative comfort. And I do think that's something to be proud of, even though it sucks that those battles had to be fought at all, and that battles are still having to be fought for our rights. The fact that I can add another voice, another perspective to the conversation, I don't know, I'm feeling weirdly emotional about this, but yeah, I am proud. And for our final Patreon question, I'm curious about your thoughts on quirklessness in My Hero Aka, which is an interesting question. I could probably make a video about this. I don't think I will. Maybe in the future at some point, I don't know. Obviously, in the context of that show, where, like, the majority of the population has a quirk, it's quite literally a disability. It comes with, like, medical markers. Granted, in the story, it's presented as this portion of the population has not reached the same level of evolution as the rest, which is an interesting take. But one of the things that always kind of bothered me was the fact that Deku couldn't stay quirkless and follow his dreams. The story, if you take quirklessness to be analogous to disability, took a disabled kid, cured his disability, and said, okay, now you can go follow your dreams. What's particularly disappointing in that regard is that apparently there was an earlier concept where Deku was supposed to be more Batman-like. That is, a superhero who has no special powers aside from training and what he can do with his brain. And I think if the story had gone that route, it would obviously be massively different, but I think it would be really fucking cool to see that, actually. But again, I'm not caught up with the story, so take all I just said with a pinch of salt. And now we move on to the YouTube comments. Is there a history behind the character that you in your videos use to represent yourself? And is it a different character than your profile picture? Yes and yes. The history behind my, in-video avatar is that essentially there was this thing going around of, designing yourself as a video game boss. So the character in my videos is a version of that, but obviously in less ostentatious clothing. It is technically a different character from my profile picture because while both are me, the character in my profile picture is like me as a Tolkien dwarf, essentially. So yeah, that's the deal on that. Do any of your family and friends know about your channel, and what do they think of it? Yes, I think most of my family and friends know about my channel, at least, all of my friends know, and I know for sure that all of my close family knows. Don't know how aware my extended family is. My sister, my mom, and my stepdad are all, supportive of it or whatever. And my dad is a bit more of a question mark because he would love for me to get a normal job. But on the whole, most of the people in my life know about the channel and are either, ambivalent, they don't care, which is obviously fine. It's you don't have to... You literally do not have to watch my videos to be my friend. That's, not a requirement. So they're either ambivalent or they're actively supportive. I'm curious about how you chose your username. Well, there's a story behind that one. It goes all the way back to when I was a weebab and dipping my toes into the wild world of the internet for the first time. And if anyone remembers this, I wanted to make an account on a website called Dragon Adopters, where you could adopt virtual pet dragons. So I went to my mom and asked if I could do this, because I was the kind of kid who, when my mom told me, this is something you need to take seriously, I took that seriously. So he then checked out the site and said, yeah, I think you can be on this. What do you want your username to be? Because obviously I couldn't use my real name on the internet. Which is kind of wild to me that that rule just, like, vanished at some point while I was growing up. My first thought was that I wanted to be Bookworm, because, as I've already said, I've always been obsessed with stories, but I think that username was already taken or something like that. So I started thinking that, okay, what else do I enjoy? And very quickly I came to the conclusion that, oh, I enjoy nature. I love going out into the forest, and I love climbing trees. So then I started to think about that, and I was like, okay, Oakwyrm. That sounds kind of similar to the original idea, and it pulls from another source of stuff I enjoy. And there was, like, specifically an oak tree in the yard where I grew up that I climbed in a lot, and, like, in the area, there were kind of, like, a few oak trees, like, you'd always find acorns on the sidewalk and stuff. So, yeah, that's how Oakwyrm became a thing, and yes, I have been known by the same username for my entire internet existence. And here we have a 3-for-1. What program do you use to make your artwork? Who's your favorite fictional character? Can I draw fan art of your persona? I use Clip Studio Paint. I got it when it was still just like one purchase. I don't know what's up with this subscription stuff. I haven't really kept up with that, but like my version's just the one-time purchase version. Who's your favorite fictional character? Is an impossible question to answer, but if I have to pick just one, I guess Gimli, son of Gloin. Can you draw fan art? Yes, obviously. I am so flattered whenever I see anyone has drawn art of my persona or any of my OCs. It's just like absolutely fucking mind-blowing. What disability terminology do you use in your day-to-day life in Swedish? I wanted to answer this one because I very rarely get to talk about the fact that I'm a Swedish-speaking Finn on this channel, so yeah, the terminology I use in general life in Swedish is I call myself funktionsnedsatt, which is just like the word for disabled, but translated literally it means something like functionally reduced. For the most part, I don't really have anything that bothers me about how, like, in just basic language, disabled people are referred to in Swedish. Obviously, slurs are a different story. I've been called ableist slurs before I was diagnosed as anything that would actually class me as disabled, which is an interesting story in and of itself, but the one thing I don't love is the fact that accessible bathrooms, at least in Finland Swedish, I don't know about elsewhere, are called invavese, which is short for invalidvese, and vese being water closet WC, and technically it would be dublavese, but no one has time to say that, so it's been shortened to vese. Invalid is exactly the word it sounds like. It's invalid, which I guess isn't a huge deal, but it's just like something that sticks in my brain from time to time that doesn't feel great. What are your favorite interests and hobbies when you're high on spoons? What are your favorite interests and hobbies when you're low on spoons? That's actually a really interesting question. When I'm high on spoons, I've already mentioned this, but I really like being in nature. I like taking walks in nature. I like archery. I haven't had the chance to do it in a while, but I really enjoy archery. I love swimming. And obviously, art. You can pretty much tell that, like, I had a period of time where I was just, like, doing great because there was, like, so much art on my Tumblr, and I was making more of it all of the time, and that usually means that I have a lot of extra energy. If you've noticed that I've barely been making any art, that usually means that I've not been feeling great, which sucks because I love making art, but what can you do? My fallbacks when I'm low on spoons are video games, reading, and writing. Those are things that I can always count on to be able to do at least a little bit of. Which do you like experiencing or seeing more, watching the sunset or watching the sunrise? Oh, sunrise all the way, which sucks for me, because I am a chronic night owl. But I guess it doesn't matter as much in Finland, because even as south as I live, our seasons get a little bit wild with the light. Like, no matter what, in the summer, if I wake up before sunrise, I'm doing something wrong. And in the winter, if I wake up after sunrise, something has gone absolutely fucking haywire with my sleep schedule. How many languages do you speak, and which ones are they? Fluently, I speak two languages, English and Swedish. I understand Finnish, but I can't really speak it. And I have a sorta shaky grasp on German, and that's it. What is your favorite season and why? What fond memory do you have correlating with that time of year? So, my favorite season used to be spring because I'm born in the spring, and like there was this whole story that my parents always used to tell me about like how the spring that I was born, things didn't really like kick off until the day after I'd been born. So that year I literally brought the spring with me, and I always loved that. But these days I actually really love the fall. I hate summer, so autumn always comes with like this sense of relief, and then the colors of the trees are all so pretty, and it's just like the weather's like perfect, like you get these like rainy overcast days that are like kind of dreary but in like a cozy way, and then you get like these crisp clear afternoons where it's just like so nice to be outside and just breathe. What is your favorite band, album, and song? My favorite band is The Mechanisms. My favorite album is The Bifrost Incident by The Mechanisms. But my favorite song is Oak and Ash and Thorn by The Longest Johns. It would feel a little bit fake if I didn't say that one, because I've listened to it so many times. What are your thoughts on independent animation? Like Has-Been Hotel, Hell of a Boss, Murder Drones, or even Lackadaisy? Well, first of all, I think independent animation is super impressive and fantastic that it has like this opportunity to be a thing and find an audience because of the internet. Like, it's amazing that people are getting to do this. As for the shows you mentioned, Has-Been Hotel and Hell of a Boss aren't really my style. Same with Murder Drones. I watched the first episode, don't really vibe with it. Lackadaisy, I watched the pilot and absolutely fell in love instantly. You recently did a book review on the Fallout family. I've noticed that you tend to focus more on films and TV shows. Will book reviews be as common as that, or was this more of a one-off? Well, I don't think book reviews will ever be as common on this channel as films and TV shows because of the combination of ADHD and dyslexia. Actually sitting down to read a book is kind of a challenge for me, but I'm not at all opposed to reviewing more books if anyone has suggestions for that. I know, like, I've gotten suggestions for the Stormlight Archive, also from just, like, personal friends who think that I would, like the books in general. So, that's, like, a massive series, though. So if I do plan to review that, it's going to take me a fucking while to get through all of the material I would need to read first. Do you think romance is an underexplored topic when it comes to disabled characters, especially when it's from the perspective of a disabled character? In short, yes, absolutely, there is a shortage of, like, disabled love stories out there. I think mostly because we are so often infantilized, that feels like a plausible explanation for that. Will you ever do a video talking about the disability rep in South Park? I have watched exactly one episode of South Park. It was on accident, as a young teenager. This episode that I saw made me literally sick to my stomach and kind of low-key traumatized me, and everything I've heard about South Park since has not made me any more interested in watching it. So no, I'm not touching that show with a 10-foot pole. For this one, let's start with the less serious one. What is my favorite video game? It's Elden Ring. What are your feelings on trans medicalists? Bullshit. That's it. Bullshit. It's bullshit. Any video you regret doing? If yes, then why, and what lesson did you learn because of it? I think there's two primary examples I could give, because yes, there are some videos I regret making. One was a video on Sally Face, the video game, and in it, like, on the whole, it wasn't a terrible video, but in it I made a pretty big oversight, and one of my criticisms ended up being, like, entirely moot. And what I learned from that is simply just to be more thorough, because I thought I'd been thorough, but obviously I hadn't been. Like, I completely overlooked something that would have, like, changed how I approached the video in the first place. And the second one was my video on Arcane. And that one I regret making because I did not like Arcane. The fact that I just didn't like the show made me a lot harsher in how I delivered my criticisms, and made me think through my criticisms a lot less, and, not word stuff quite right. There are still parts of that video that I'm cool with, but it's overshadowed by the fact that, my personal discomfort with the show kind of took over the video instead of it being about the show. And that's why it's not on the channel anymore. I don't think I'll ever remake that video because then I would have to rewatch Arcane, and I don't want to do that because I don't like the show. No hate to you if you do, I just don't personally vibe with it. And also, the way they animated Jinx's hallucinations legitimately gives me a migraine. So, there's that. Any advice on convincing parents, teachers, or professionals that a mobility aid is needed? Recently begun realizing it would help a lot in terms of managing fatigue, but when we tried putting together a makeshift cane, got very negative reactions from parents. First of all, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I know firsthand how difficult it can be when a parental figure tries to insist that you don't need a mobility aid. I dealt with that my entire life growing up from my dad, and I don't know that I really have any good advice in how to convince them that it's needed before you start using it, because that's how my dad eventually acquiesced and acknowledged that I needed my mobility aids because I started using them and he saw how much they helped me. But I had to put up with all of his whinging about, do I really have to use the crutches? Do I have to use the cane? Do I have to have a wheelchair? I had to put up with all of that and physically show him that I was better with it before he became chill about it. So unfortunately, my advice boils down to, I don't know, I just did it and let the evidence speak for itself. As for, teachers and professionals, if they give you shit about, mobility aids, I'm pretty sure you can, complain about that, actively. That doesn't feel allowed. Really feels like there should be some protections on that one. How comfortable do you feel with viewers talking about your disability and being trans? Are you okay with us respectfully joking about it? Do you prefer it not mentioned unless in some contexts, or something in the middle? Well, for starters, obviously I'm okay with you discussing my disability and the fact that I'm trans. That in and of itself is, absolutely not an issue. As for the jokes, as long as you're not being ableist or transphobic, go nuts with it. Have a ball. And finally, I have an extremely important question that must be answered with haste and clarity for the benefit of all your audience, and perhaps even the world at large. What's your favorite sweet? It's black licorice, and I won't apologize for it. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, consider liking it and maybe subscribing. And a massive thank you goes out to the Entmoot, our newest member, Pastel Pink Firefox. I will be back here Thursday after next. Bye!